Hello, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum from Idaho State. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Pleasure to be with you.
And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Meldrum studies Bigfoot. And like I was telling you before this, since I was a little kid, I used to watch what's the one with Leonard Nimoy? Was it Mysteries of the Unknown or something?
I think it was In Search of with
In
Leonard Nimoy.
Search of, yes.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing, and I get chills thinking of it, seeing that Patterson tape, the film, and how shaky and that was really what we've had to go by. And besides footprints, I always remember in the 80s growing up as a kid too, you'd always see something in the news where someone got captured footprints and you'd see the plaster cast and stuff. And then lately it seems like it's kind of died down. But one thing I loved and I want to talk to you about is it was Searching for Bigfoot, right? The documentary where you took the Patterson film and took it to a lab and you guys broke that thing down frame by frame and movement.
I don't
And
remember the title. There have been so many.
well, that because my background's exercise physiology, so I know anatomy, physiology, how the body moves, everything. And okay, we're talking about the 60s, right? That film was made in the 60s. That was taken in the 60s, correct?
1967.
And I remember Joe Rogan talking about this too, and he swears it's a gorilla suit. And I'm just like, how can that be? You've seen the films back then. When guys had a gorilla suit on, you knew that was a guy in a gorilla suit. And
Absolutely.
when you guys broke this down, frame by frame and movement by movement, when that head turns and the arms are swaying and that bulge on the thigh,
Yeah.
you guys pick that bulge up. There's no,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You know what? I know there's not a whole lot of proof, but that was that was real. I'm convinced the way you guys showed that there's no way that was a human being wearing a 1960s gorilla suit.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you get into studying Bigfoot? How has it been a passion of yours for your life? How is that?
Yeah, I can trace the roots back to my youth and early experiences. I mean, my first exposure, you described that the impressive impact of seeing that film. Well, for me as a young 10-year-old, seeing that film shown in the Spokane Coliseum in I think it was '68, um, that made obviously a lasting impression, and that sort of set the wheels in motion. That was my first exposure to the notion of Bigfoot, but it was right in line with so many interests that I was cultivating even at an early age, in natural history and wildlife and evolution and human prehistory, and all those things just kind of rolled together into that figure walking across that sandbar. So it really captivated me, and that, as I've said, that interest waxed and waned over the years as other distractions came and went and so forth. But my career ended up um, through a number of circumstances landing me square in the middle of the type of work that would put me in a very good position, so that when the opportunity presented itself, I was I was very well positioned to participate and contribute, and it has become a real passion. It's as you know, anyone who's involved in science and exploration is passionate about the questions that they're asking, the things that they're trying to discover. And so that was me too with this, and it's become more and more consuming. I mean, as I sort of crest in my career, I crest and can see that end in on the horizon, not too soon, but to the point where I've really kind of seriously weighed and considered what can I accomplish, in the next decade, and what contribution can I make, and what initiatives can we push to try to further this beyond where we are right now. That's, I think, a real important point. As you kind of alluded to, things have, it's sort of the same old, and the same arguments, debates that rage between skeptics and enthusiasts and interested parties. That I think we're at a point now where some technologies are available where maybe we can advance the search to a new level.
Do you find it difficult? Because I know I've read a little bit about your career and stuff, and where you get pushed back, and some of your peers aren't exactly thrilled about what you're doing because they look at it as cryptology and there's no real proof. But also, you get people. I don't know if you've seen the guy in Canada. I think his name is Todd Shandling. Have you met him? Shandling.
Todd Standing. Yes, I've met him.
I watched it. I'm sorry. I watched the documentary that he did, and it was on Netflix. And that guy made a mockery of it, because some of the things, like he had an infrared camera and he put an apple out on a log, and all of a sudden you see this hand come and take it. And that was a Bigfoot. And then he's talking about these structures they make, and he's putting apples and everything, but he put no trail cameras up, but he swore the apples were taken by Bigfoots. Meanwhile, he leaves apples out in the woods where there's squirrels, there's raccoons, everything else that can get to them.
Well,
and
sure.
then he's talking about the scent with the guards that sit there and watch while the family feeds at the river. And I'm sorry, for me, that documentary, I looked at that guy as just complete phony. Everything seemed like that. Nothing seemed real. Like he showed one run up a mountain, and it looked like a guy in a suit. That looked like a guy in a suit.
Yeah. Well, many other people share your opinion. I'm still sort of on the fence. I went up there, spent 5 days with him, and along with Dr. John Bindernagel in the field, and there were we had an excellent time. It's a fantastic location to work in the field, and we did see what I couldn't dismiss offhandedly as Sasquatch footprints. Examples that weren't enormous. They were 13 to 14 inches in length. And we had an encounter of sorts. Something approached the camp and vocalized and was breaking brush. And I thought I caught a glimpse of it through the night vision. So, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You're right that there's sometimes Todd is his own worst enemy in the way he, conducts his dissemination, his presentation, but on the other hand, he's out there doing things, and he's put his evidence up for scrutiny, and not everyone is quick to condemn it, and I've taken all kinds of flack from various quarters for even going up there at his invitation, and so as if by doing so I'm tainting myself. I will evaluate anybody's evidence. I deal with most people don't have a clue about the flood of reports and evidence that I deal with on a daily basis. I mean, literally daily basis. And a lot of it is, unfortunately, it just doesn't rise to the level of serious consideration. I mean, of serious evidence. I mean, we should consider it seriously and evaluate it on established criteria. I mean, for example, I know another pair of footprints was shown to me, and I take the time to outline the arch and outline the toe positions and the compression of the toes and the little toe turned on its side, and to try to educate. I mean, I use it as an opportunity to try to educate, and sometimes not just that individual, but sometimes dispersing that a little more widely as an example, as a visual aid, if you will. And but there's a lot of stuff that has to be winnowed through, and every once in a while there's a grain of good, interesting evidence that contributes to the dialogue.
Speaking of footprints, now I know that when you also in your documentaries that some of the plaster casts you have those dermal ridges on them, correct?
A very few. Yeah, it's a very rare feature, but yeah.
That right there, I mean, someone has to really go out of their way to put that amount of force into the ground to put an imprint that leaves those dermal ridges. Because that's pretty much fingerprints. Like that distinguishes, that gives how fingerprints make
Right.
each individual.
Same principle. Same principle.
Okay.
We have those same friction skin ridges on the soles of our feet, as well as on the palms of our hands and tips of our fingers. And yeah, it's like I said, though, it's a very rare circumstance. You have to have a substrate that has a fine enough particulate size that it will pick up that fine resolution of detail and hold it long enough for the footprint to be discovered, and then for someone to have the wherewithal to cast it, skillfully enough that those fine details transfer to the plaster. So there's only been a half dozen to a dozen or so specimens with varying amounts of skin ridge detail exhibited, and some of those have been justifiably questioned. It turns out that there are some circumstances that can cause artifactual appearance of ridge-like patterns. Just like, the example is if you've ever made pancakes, on a real hot griddle, and you pour that pancake batter, and as that pancake batter hits, it cooks, but then the raw batter slides over the edge repeatedly, and you turn that pancake over, and there's these parallel ridges. That can happen. That same principle almost can express itself with the footprints. If the soil is very hot and dry, very powdery, and it has a wicking quality, it will suck the water right out of the plaster, causes it to kick, just like cook the batter cooking on the griddle, and then the wet plaster flows over the top, repeatedly. And some people have pointed that out, and there's one or two that are like that, but we have others that are imprinted and cast under the absolute opposite conditions, wet, cold conditions, where the plaster wouldn't behave that way. And those have produced really remarkable skin ridge detail that, it's interesting that it's those who don't really have a dog in the fight that are more objective in their evaluation. So some of the latent fingerprint examiners, like Officer Jimmy Chilcutt, that worked with me for a while, and a couple of his instructors, that he showed some of these details. We had one cast that had a very distinctive scar, and you could see how it had impacted the ridge pattern in the healing scarring process. And it happened that Officer Chilcutt had just completed a recertification class that had a workshop on the use of scars as identifying features in fingerprints. So we made a latex peel of that detail. He took it and showed it to his instructor. I was absolutely satisfied that was the real deal. That was real fingerprint, and it showed all of the hallmarks of the effects of that scarring process on the ridge pattern in living tissue. So, it's kind of interesting that you have those opinions versus then others who just dismiss it out of hand because it can't be. I mean, I get so tired of that refrain. It can't exist, therefore it doesn't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have. And so, not a very, very objective or scientific attitude to approach the subject with.
I did an interview yesterday for my podcast with, his name's Jamie Jonkel, and he's the bear management specialist for Montana.
Oh.
And I mentioned that you would be coming on, and I said, what are your thoughts on Bigfoot? And he goes, you know what? Because he's out there. He's out in the wild. And he says, you know what? I can't rule it out. I can't. He said, I can't rule it out. I've never seen one, but I can't rule. And I think about just recently, they discovered a new species of whale, correct? If I remember correct. Yeah.
Could have been. Yeah. That's
that was off in the Pacific somewhere. So, I mean, how long have we been on this planet and surfing the oceans and stuff?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of remote country. And we know there's a Gigantopithecus, correct? That's the name?
That's right. Gigantopithecus, thought to have gone extinct a couple hundred
And
thousand years ago.
and just like we know, there was was it the megalodon, the big shark?
Sure. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So,
Mag-
but it eventually uh uh deceased. I can't think of the word I'm thinking
When
of.
extinct.
Extinct.
Yeah.
However, there's some damn big great white sharks still that
Yeah.
kind of still make you think. So I mean, like, yeah, you can't rule it out. I mean, I think about all the trail cameras that are out there now, and I've seen some where some guys again they just it's fake, but I I I just go back to that Patterson tape and the way you guys broke that thing down, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
For at least one moment in time, that is a Bigfoot that is captured, and it is not a man in a gorilla suit. Yeah, so
Yeah, that really set the bar pretty high, in my opinion. My conclusion, I should say, because I would get after people for relying.
Why do
on
people? And that guy, they always bring his credibility into question because supposedly he was like a con man, and didn't he work in Hollywood or something?
No,
And that's
no,
what.
no, he didn't. He was a bit of a, he may have suffered from ADHD. I think he just couldn't stay focused on any one particular project. He was kind of a jack of all trades. He was a very clever guy. Yeah, I mean, if someone was going to come up with something, he might have been the one, given the proper resources and knowledge and technology, which wasn't available then. But he was always coming up with ideas and running off to try to get a patent on this or that. He kind of bounced from position, so he had a reputation of kind of a ne'er do well. But hey, that sure, that's a factor, but it certainly isn't the primary factor in evaluating. You look at the product. You can attack his character all you want, but that doesn't address the what is on the film, and in terms of its biomechanics, its comparative anatomy, its the scientific context of something like that. It's just when the 50th anniversary rolled around, I put together a presentation. So when I was invited to speak, I focused on that 50-year retrospective kind of on the film, and when what do we think about it now, or what should we think about it now as scientists? What's the context? And what strikes me so impressively is there are so many aspects of that film which in 1967 actually ran right across the grain of what was considered conventional wisdom in anthropology at that time. Without going into all those details, it's just that it actually anticipated, in those contradictions, it anticipated what we now know. It is right aligned with what we now know about early hominin evolution and in combination of traits. One of the most telling examples, and I'll repeat this ad nauseum, without apology to those who've heard it already, but John Napier was a primatologist, one of the more open-minded scientists when it came to this topic. He was on the panel that viewed the film at the Smithsonian, and he was impressed enough, apparently, that eventually he wrote a book on the topic, which included a treatment of the film, which he was rather negative on, except that he could really only point to one factor that caused him to reject it. And that was, he said, when you look at that figure on the film, from the waist up, it looks like a gorilla. From the waist down, it looks typically human. He said it was essentially inconceivable that such a hybridization of traits would be combined in nature. Therefore, it must be a hoax. Well, it's interesting because the book was published in 72 or 73. And just a few years later, there were the headline grabbing discoveries in East Africa of the much more complete skeletons of these early Australopithecines, namely Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And how did they describe it in the popular press? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, wait a minute. That was the very hitch that prevented Napier from accepting the film as genuine. What if he'd waited just a few years before he he published his book and published it with that in the background. I mean, that one objection that he hung his dismissal of the film upon was eliminated, absolutely eliminated. We look at that film now, and that's exactly how we envision, say, a robust Australopithecus like Paranthropus boisei from East Africa might have looked like, in its body proportions, in its facial proportions, the flat, deep jaws without projecting canines, the robust muscular body build as opposed to the slender, marathon running human physique and so on. It's just, how could, maybe Patterson or whoever might have guessed and got one thing just right out of dumb luck, but a half a dozen different absolutely incongruous characteristics that are absolutely congruous now, got it right on every point. I just don't, and the naysayers who quibble over little perceived gaps or wrinkles that are in the wrong place, or, the perception of the outline of his shoulder pad. I mean, these ridiculous statements where they focus on one frame and nitpick on one frame without taking the whole thing in context. Those just pale by comparison to the remarkable consistency and the remarkable anatomy that's obvious to those who are learned in those fields, those pertinent fields. So you get me going, obviously, get me cranked up here. And
I'm all about it, because I love, again, here's another characteristic that you pointed out in that film when you broke it down, the breasts. So you determined it was a female, correct?
Right.
And again, go watch an Abbott and Costello or Three Stooges and see someone in a gorilla suit, and then see if it looks anything remote. The back is flat. It's not. I mean, the way that head turned, and you got, you guys showed that it had. So if it had breasts, and does that, and could you just determine by the way they were that she's possibly had young, or?
Well, that's an interesting point. Well, obviously, I mean, she looks a bit what's the word, haggard, maybe. She looks like she's got some miles on the on the chassis, and so I would suspect that certainly she has. But it's interesting, this is more just anecdotal, I guess, and maybe not as objective, but aspects of it. I had a student who came into my office one time, and I had a picture of from the frame of the film, the 362 frame. And it not 360, whatever, it's 352. I went blanked it for a minute. But in any case, you could clearly see her rather engorged breasts that appears that she's lactating, but also she has a little bit of a lap, a little bit of a where the belly kind of hangs over the belt. And of course, the critics have pointed that and say, well, that's just her lax costume hanging over the waistband, Well, but it just goes around to the sides. It stops right at the midriff, and very anatomically accurate for a loose belly skin. And I had a student walk in. He looked up and he goes, "Oh, look, she just had a baby. His wife had just given birth." He witnessed for the first time, you take that baby out of the womb and there's all this excess skin, which begins to tighten back up, as the hormones have their effect. But for a while, there's a little bit of loose skin there, and it looks remarkably similar to this. So I thought that was an interesting observation. But I think that's why the breasts are so prominent, and they're not often described in terms of what you see. She's kind of a Dolly Parton figure there, and I think it's because of that. Not to be flipped there, but the point is, I think the obvious presence of those breasts is indicative of lactating, which has made them more evident. And even some people have seen that film several times that had never noticed the breasts. So it doesn't surprise me that they're not mentioned that often reports of eyewitnesses because their hair covered, they blend in color wise, and if there's any reasonable distance between you and the subject, you're not going to see those kinds of details. But the anatomy is there. I mean, Bill Munns and I did some research. He pointed out some details, and I was able to finance a little project where he looked specifically at that anatomy. He pointed out quite accurately when there's a point where, every once in a while you'll be walking along and say the sidewalk is a little sunken, or you step in a hole and you're not expecting it, and you come down with a rather jolting, jarring stop, and there's a point where her foot does that. The step was perhaps a little, or the sandbar, dropped off just a little more than she expected. She comes down with a bit of a jolt, and you can actually see the shock wave go up through the musculature of her leg, right up her torso, and you see the breast compress like that as the tissue reacts to that shock wave. So he did some experimentation on various kinds of costume, water-filled, water balloon breasts, and shot-filled, whatever, little buckwheats or whatever to fill them up, and as well as some human models, and demonstrated the fact that behaves like real tissue, not by like a styrofoam, addition to a off-the-shelf costume. Because hey, gorilla suits off the shelf don't come with pendulous breasts as standard options. That's not typical feature.
And they don't move the way you just demonstrated they move.
No, even the way it sits on the chest, it sits in a way that that most people, because they're thinking in terms of Victoria's Secret models or something, but they're low on the chest. You can see the pec up here, and then it comes down, and then there's the breast tissue. But it blends into the armpit. There's the axillary fold right there. That's just absolutely natural. It just, it's so, it's just so natural. I mean, I've looked at it.
And here's another thing from that time. Speaking of the gorilla suits, they put the head on, and
Right.
Another thing you did with that tape when you demonstrated the way it turned its head, you could see there was no. Just the head was turning, right. The body, the shoulders, sure. And everything turned along with the head, which sure. A gorilla suit head would have you would see that break where the head.
Right. You either see the break or you see very pronounced folds in the fabric.
Right.
There was a fellow who submitted a paper to my Relic Hominoid Inquiry journal on costumes. I mean, this was the guy who did costume design and had won awards for his innovative costumes. He loved to go to the Halloween costume parties because he always walked away with the first prize and everything. But he was very familiar with the history of it and all, and the technology. And he points out the neck is always the most problematic area. And you look at the examples that are out there in cinema in the older days, and what did they do? They left the hair, facial hair, long. So like the Bigfoot on $6 Million Man has a big long beard that comes down to here. He even points out when they did the Grinch, they didn't even make the costume go up his neck. They left the neck uncovered and just covered it in green paint, but then put long chin whiskers on the adult, and even the little guy. I mean, that was part of the joke, is he had whiskers when he was just a little kid. But there are the tricks of the trade. But most costumes, and that's one of the biggest giveaways. If you see a video online claiming to be a Sasquatch, look at the back here. The costumes will accentuate that rounded back of the head with the often wimpy trapezius tucked way up underneath. So you get this bubble head on a pencil neck. The more elaborate animatronic costumes now that are really trying to imitate a gorilla, build things up with more armature around the neck to give it that effect of like you point out, of the head being more jutted forward and heavy trapezius muscles behind. And it's interesting, you know, Patty doesn't emulate that at all, but emulates something intermediate, exactly like you would see in something like a robust Australopithecine, a creature that's adapted to an upright posture, but still has this heavy face, small brain, so it's not balanced really well on the spine like ours is, and therefore requires a rather significant mass to the trapezius with a larger attachment area, and higher up on the back of the occipital bone than is found in humans. And so, yeah, I mean, it stands up. It stood up for 50 years, and as our understanding of evolution and anthropology has increased, in my opinion, it stands up even more impressively because it's so in line with so much of what we've only learned in the past couple of decades.
Well, it's also interesting to note that the area that it was filmed in Northern California, the Native Americans back in the day, didn't they carve out statues similar like to that of a creature representing a Bigfoot?
Right,
now,
a bit further north. More the totem pole tradition is more up in the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. But you're right. You can go anywhere, and where there is contemporary reports of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, and if you look into the native traditions, the indigenous populations, and bearing in mind too that sometimes those populations, sadly, are not residing in the areas that they had traditionally. So there's been a lot of displacement, and so you get carryover of traditional stories and beliefs that don't necessarily jive one-to-one with the geography anymore. But the point is, they were here long before Europeans, and their cultures, their traditions, their belief systems have a place for this wild man of the woods and wild woman of the woods. They're there, there.
I mean, they in their totem poles they've included eagles. I mean, all these animals that exist. Sure. Why would I understand they do their spiritual journeys and stuff, but right. to all come up with a creature that resembles an ape-like man and carve it out? That's kind of too much of a coincidence, I would think.
Well, yeah, and all you have to do is ask the living members of those cultures, and they acknowledge that. Yeah, they for them, as for many people, the boundary between the physical realm, the spiritual realm, is not a hard and fast demarcation. It's a blending of the two. And so they imbue many of these natural animals, these commonly known animals, with all sorts of qualities and personalities and characteristics. So that's not surprising in the least. It would be odd if they didn't, but that doesn't diminish the fact that behind the stories, it's like I said, the legend or the fundamental question is there a biological species as we understand species in Western science today? Is there a biological species behind the legend of Sasquatch? And I'm quite convinced that there is. It's just a matter of time before that's acknowledged and demonstrated conclusively, and we're still on that road.
Here's another interesting point that you brought up earlier, is about the sounds. And one thing I've noticed too is when there happens to be someone, and it's usually at nighttime, and they're at a cabin or somewhere, and rocks will be thrown at them and trees will be banged. And it's not like all these people are communicating somehow and sharing the same stories, but it seems to be a pattern that whenever there seems to be a remote chance that there is a creature out there, they all do the same: throw the rocks, throw the sticks, bang the trees. Now,
Yeah.
is that saying, hey, watch your gut? Is that what is the meaning behind all that?
Yeah, well, I really can't presume. I can just if we extrapolate from or compare, draw analogy with the behaviors of known great apes, who also throw sticks and throw stones, and as they become um, curious and interested in a human onlooker, where they don't their curiosity reaches a point that it outweighs their fear, or their fear's been allied because the humans have behaved in a non-aggressive, non-threatening way, then yeah, they're checking things out. I mean, you look at the progression of the ability of people like Dian Fossey and Jane Goodall to interact with these wild apes, and there are remarkable parallels. These are Sasquatch are shy and retreating creatures, but I think they get curious when there's a brightly lit picture window in a cabin with people doing things, and the smell of the campfire, or the fireplace, wafting from the chimney, or maybe the smell of food coming out through a window. They're gonna check things out, and so peering into windows, trying doors, or pitching rocks onto a tent or onto tin roof. Those are just natural behaviors, I think, that are a combination of curiosity, but it may also involve intimidation behaviors. They're when you throw a marble or sized or a golf ball sized rock at someone, that's not a real threatening gesture, but more one just maybe to get your attention, or to encourage you perhaps to move along, nothing to see here. Or it could be more aggressive. I mean, there was one report I always was impressed by. It was dramatized in a documentary, and I had actually had the chance to speak to someone who had a very similar experience, but they came face to face with a Sasquatch on the trail, and they freaked out. They were just terrified, and instead of running back down the trail, they ran straight down the mountainside through the trees, and this apparently the Sasquatch was in hot pursuit. At one point, they stumbled and pitched headlong into the pine needle duff, and the Sasquatch just stopped and waited for them to pick themselves up and dust themselves off and start running again. So it wasn't trying to catch him; it was simply trying to herd him away. Who knows, from an offspring, from a food source, from a mate, any number of motivations that other animals might also exhibit. So, yeah, I think most of their behavior is. Dr. Bindernagel really established this theme. Well, maybe not originally, but at least substantiated it, I think, tremendously in his book, North America's Great Ape, the Sasquatch. And he wasn't a primatologist, he was a wildlife biologist, but he was quite capable of navigating the primary literature on primate behavior, great ape behavior. And he drew these remarkable parallels in things that people report and behaviors that are documented for the great apes. And, it's there's remarkable parallels. Now, some of your viewers, I mean, this is a schism in the Bigfoot community, whether it's ape or whether it's more human. And we could draw parallels with our own behaviors, our own more simplistic behaviors with great apes. That doesn't make me a great ape per se, although we share the same taxonomic family where, our closest relative is a chimpanzee. And so don't get up in arms. I entertain, I mean, it's really splitting hairs. Which side of the fence, you're literally straddling the fence if it is a type of great ape, of which the known great apes are just a fraction of the taxonomic and behavioral and morphological diversity, or is it on the lineage leading to humans? Now, I won't give up ground to the point of saying, well, it could be a Homo erectus or Neanderthal. There's absolutely no evidence to support that. whatsoever in morphology or especially in behavior. If it is on that side of the fence, of that fork in the road, then it's a very early representative of the type of diversity. Like we mentioned earlier, the robust Australopithecines are a great comparison to make because of so many remarkable similarities, and in morphology and in behavior, the lack of tools, lack of fire, etc. That suggests that it's that this creature exists based on its brawn, not its brain size. And you look at the Patterson-Gimlin film again, if we can accept that for a moment for the sake of the conversation as an accurate representation of what a Bigfoot is, it has a brain relative to its body size that's about on par with a gorilla, or a little bit bigger. Give it another extra 50 or 100 cc's, well, especially given the size. A gorilla has a cranium that's about 500 cc's in volume. And obviously there's a little increase in brain size with body mass, but not a whole lot in this case, in this group. So it's, give it an extra 10%, 15% over a gorilla or a chimp, but still, we're still nowhere in the ballpark for early human, brain size and associated behaviors.
Another thing, like growing up too, is anytime there was a sighting or footprints, it was always out west. And it seems now we hear about, was it Skookum in the swamps, or the there's sightings in the mountains of West Virginia, I guess. And
sure.
Do you find those more hoax than anything? Because it seems it's more populated east, and
yes,
it seems like that the sightings would be more prevalent. And anytime there's been a sighting, it's always turns out to be a hoax a lot of times.
A lot of times, or not, more often than not, rather than a hoax, a case of misidentification, where people read too much into a flash of fur or a footprint which turns out to be human, even if it is in a seemingly unusual or inexplicable location or time of the year. A rule of thumb that I use, and it's just a starting point. I'm not saying that it's gospel or that it's the end all, but it's a jumping off point, because there's been data to demonstrate that this is a true relationship. There seems to be a good correlation between the present range of black bear in North America and Sasquatch. They have a similar habitat preference, wooded lands, particularly mountainous forests, and they have to be productive enough forests that will support a large omnivore. And black bear and Sasquatch, I think, divide that omnivore niche by different types of chewing morphologies, as well as and dietary adaptations of the gut physiology. One's coming from a primate ancestor, one's coming from a carnivore ancestor, and they have a legacy that is quite different and gives different opportunities. But the second thing, so if you look at a map, you can see black bears distributed in the western United States, the Rocky Mountains, up and through Canada, across the boreal forest, around the Great Lakes, New England states, down the backside of Appalachia into the deep south, and kind of button hooking up into the four corners of Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. That's where you find the black bear, and where I think the credible reports of Sasquatch are to be found. The other thing to bear in mind, though, and you made a very good point, is not just the fact that there are black bear there, but how many are there? Because these Sasquatch are extremely rare. And so, for example, here in Idaho, we have 35,000 black bear, but based on, I won't go into the rationale and the criteria for coming to this conclusion, but I estimate that in Idaho there's maybe 150 to 300 Sasquatch, given inferences based on the presumed social structure, home range size, frequency of footprint finds, repeat appearances, etc. So, when you consider just that difference in magnitude, 35,000 versus, let's say, 350, how many more zeros you put behind 350 to come up with 35,000. And so, for every Sasquatch, there's several hundred black bear. So you go to somewhere like Georgia. I don't have all the stats at the top of my head, but you get over there and you're not talking about tens of thousands of black bear. You're talking about, thousands, a couple thousand in this state, maybe 5,000 in one of the more densely populated with black bear states. And so I would expect then that ratio, if that ratio has some validity, then, some of those states, there's only 2 or 3 or 4 Sasquatch. Now, it's not like they're just confined. You can't leave the state. Some of these states have habitat that's contiguous with other states, and these animals are moved. They don't recognize state boundaries. But I think that the population back east is much, much, much less than it is out here in the much more rural and wild. Like, Idaho has the most wilderness of any state in the lower 48. And so people are, hugging the southern border and way up in the panhandle, but there's just little hamlets scattered about. And a lot of it is not only cityless, townless, but it's roadless as well. And very few people go back into those areas.
Some rough terrain. Now, since they're an ape, you wouldn't consider them to be loners, right? They would have a family structure, would they not?
Well, again, realize that what we have to compare with is just the tip of the iceberg of the variation. And it's interesting, every group of great apes we know today has a different social structure, completely different from the other. And there is one, the orangutan, that is a loner. It is solitary. The male, instead of defending a harem of females, he instead defends real estate. He broadcasts his presence, this is my turf. And that happens to overlap the range, the area occupied by a female and her offspring. And they don't reproduce very often. Orangutans maybe every 4 to 8 years between births. And so when the female is ready, when she's raised and is ready to start with another offspring, she'll seek out the dominant male for his company. And, so that, I think, based on my familiarity with the reports and the fact that most footprint finds are solitary individuals or females with offspring, most sighting encounters are solitary individuals. There have been pairs seen, but maybe those are a female with a subadult offspring, or a male and female that have formed a consort pair because she's ready to conceive again. I think the evidence kind of points to that. We don't just, that's why I'm always very skeptical when someone describes, a block party of Sasquatch, and there's they describe 6, 7, 8 Sasquatch cavorting around. I have to wonder about whether that's reliable or not. I just don't know. I'm not going to be 100% judgmental, but I think it's kind of unlikely because we just don't have reports. We don't have someone stumbles onto a meadow and there's footprints all over the place because they've had a big shindig and a gathering. We don't see that, there's got to be a correlation between the reported trace evidence and the perceived behaviors. Just like recently, lots of people have been asking me, can they run on all fours? Well, I say, they probably could. They could do it more easily than we do because their arms are long and their legs are a little bit shorter. So, when they go down on all fours, their rear end isn't sticking up in the air like a stink bug. But if they were locomoting that way a lot, why have we never had a report of a trackway that included both footprints and handprints? Instead, we have handprints that, that are associated with things with getting up or getting down type of maneuvers, or going, maybe clambering up scrambling up a steep slope. Might find one. I mean, some of the tracks that we have seem to be supporting weight over the water. One handprint that I've got was underwater in a pond, probably grabbing something with the other hand. One was cast by Bob Titmus, where it had gotten down into a little water hole and it tried to get up on the muddy slope and slid, and the hand slid down and left an imprint. It's those kinds of things. I've got knuckle prints, I've got fist prints, but those are where they're supporting their weight just to get up from a posture or a position, probably, where they're down on their knees or haunches or whatever, squatting. So, that correlation needs to be there. If this, then we should expect this. And if we don't see this, then this assumption's probably not reliable.
So what about genetic DNA material? Like,
Yeah.
You talk about stink butt. Have you found any scats, any hairs, any skin cells, anything that's undetermined and you haven't been able to identify it yet? Or
well, we're in a kind of an awkward position right now with DNA. First, the water's been muddied with a couple of studies that have really misdirected attention. One just outright, in my opinion, fraudulent. The other just poorly designed so that the result was misconstrued. We have, first, let me say it categorically, we have no known DNA from Sasquatch. We have not successfully identified any, despite claims to the contrary. There's no evidence to support ideas about Sasquatch originating as hybrids between humans and some pre-human hominin of some kind. Those are just fanciful notions that have no basis, no support. And those who claim otherwise, cannot back up their allegations have been dismantled by people who are quite knowledgeable on the subject. In any case, so where are we at? Yes, we've had scat that we think might be Sasquatch. Scat's problematic because, there's two big omnivores, and the scat appearance changes with the diet. So like with bear scat, if you find it in the springtime, they're eating a lot of the fresh greens that are coming up. It looks like manure. If it's in the late fall and they're eating tons and tons of berries, it looks like a berry cobbler, squash there. If they get into a carcass, then it's a dark, putrefied, black scat from all that protein. So it varies a lot, and so because there's two possible contributors to that sample or producing that sample, then it's important that you have some association. I tell people used to send me scat every once in a while, sometimes no longer frozen, in mid-August, with a dripping, thawed out specimen. That's so I say, don't get excited about a scat unless you've got some footprints associated with it. Then and so anyway, but the problem is when we have, well, let me back up. The hair would be the most likely place easiest, straightforward, you would think, to get DNA. But unfortunately, one of the characteristics of the Sasquatch hair is the lack of a cellular medulla, that central core. And that's where a lot of the cellular material in the shaft of the hair resides, where you would get nuclei and mitochondria that would provide the DNA. So in that absence, you've got a shaft that's essentially keratin. It's just protein with very little DNA material. So we were hopeful. Brian Sykes' study was hopefully going to address that. He was confident that he could clean a hair shaft, make sure there was no contaminants on the outside, and then digest that hair and get that sparse DNA from that tissue. But unfortunately, like I said, his design was flawed, and his results were misconstrued. The fact that he didn't report any indeterminate samples, and we know that he received some that were not acknowledged. He only reported those he got results for, and it was everything, from the barnyard you would possibly imagine. And so it was distracting. So unfortunately, I mean, the biggest drawback of that, then that result is taken and run with by those who say, well, look, here's a professional, an expert who looked at the evidence, and not a single piece of evidence was unknown. It was all easily attributed to known wildlife. If he had reported those that he was unable to get DNA from, you would have all these known wildlife and 1, 2, 3, 4 samples that I can't identify. Well, if you can't identify it, that suggests there's something out there that hasn't been identified yet. That's a very different result to report, see? And so that's why my criticism of his paper, it's the same old. Anyway, so what's the problem? Well, when we do get DNA from a hair, invariably it looks like human. And it's thought, well, it's contaminated from handling, or it's just a human hair that's been misidentified, misattributed to Sasquatch. Well, the third possibility that hasn't gotten the attention is that we haven't sequenced enough DNA for a very closely related species to actually differentiate between the two. I came up with a little analogy to make this very clear. At Christmas time, we have an Advent calendar, right? And every day we open up a little door and there's 24 of them leading up to Christmas. Well, imagine we had a little Advent calendar, and behind the doors, instead of a nice, tasty piece of chocolate, there were DNA sequences, DNA fragments or markers. And say instead of 24, we've got 1,000 of these. Well, if this creature is so closely related to us that maybe less than 1% of its DNA differs, which is very conceivable, then 1%, 1 out of 100. If we've got 1,000 doors on there, then only 10 of them, if you had 1,000, it would be 10 of them would have any useful information behind them. But you're going to do a study that only focuses on maybe one gene. You only have the time and the resources and the funding. That's going to only let you open up 10 doors on your Advent calendar with 1,000 little doors. What are the chances that you're going to stumble on one of those doors that has some differentiated, one of those 10 doors that has differentiated DNA sequence? And if you don't, what's your conclusion going to be? That your sample is identical to human. You can't tell the difference. So it must be human, right? Well, not necessarily. See, that's the quandary we're at right now. And I've discussed this with a whole number of geneticists, who had no vested interest in the conversation, really, or the question, the implications of the question. And they all agree with me. Yeah, you're right. You would want to do the entire mitochondrial genome and maybe 24 nuclear genes to boot to make sure that you had enough information to conclusively differentiate or not between these two potential species. So that's where we're at. Unfortunately, we're kind of stuck. So people repeatedly ask me, where can I send my hair sample to be tested? And I go, well, there's not really very few places, unless you just go to a commercial lab, will do it. And if you requested enough testing to really differentiate it, chances are, it's going to be extremely expensive, especially through a commercial lab. And a lot of academic labs just won't touch it because, it's publish or perish, and they want to renew that grant. So they're doing mainstream research, not taking any risks because they have to have a publication at the far end of it. And so,
yeah. And someone's funding that. Do you find people will try to discredit you for that reason? Hey, you don't have any DNA. You're going to prove it. How can you prove if you don't have any?
Well, sure. Because, and some of those people, they think that I'm trying to prove Sasquatch on the basis of the existing evidence, the Patterson-Gimlin film, the footprints, and so forth, the sightings. And I'm not. I'm investigating the question, and I'm trying to push these projects that will get us closer to a definitive answer. But I acknowledge that by the conventions of zoological taxonomy, a type specimen is required. Even DNA might not be quite enough. There is no precedent to acknowledge the existence of a new species on DNA alone. However, there's been more and more discussion in the literature, especially as it relates to rare and endangered species, that perhaps we've reached an age where we can rely on a novel DNA sequence to establish the existence of a new species, and not, especially when we talked a little bit about their social structure. The lethal collection of a specimen could have a significant impact on the extended social structure, and that's not desirable. It's not ethical, especially an animal so closely related. I mean, it's like someone saying they think they've discovered a new species of great ape, a new species of gorilla on another isolated mountain range. Well, we're not going to accept it until you go up there and shoot one and bring it back. Well, I think that they would be satisfied with other types of evidence like DNA and so forth, from hair samples and scat and so forth, as well as photographic imagery. But the problem is, because at the time the subject was popularized, it scientifically was not acceptable that such a creature could exist. It was considered completely outlandish. Someone would come back with the example I just gave and say, oh, well, yeah, but that's just another kind of gorilla. We know that gorillas exist. So for there to be a new species of gorilla, that's not so far-fetched. But to suggest an upright bipedal walking creature like this, 50 years ago, that would have just, that's where I get the people saying they can't exist, therefore they don't exist. But today, you can't say that. It's absolutely possible that something like this exists. It would fit right in just like a hand in a glove with what we currently think about the nature of hominin evolution and the potential for relic populations, relic lineages to have persisted alongside us. I mean, you cannot defend the statement that they can't exist. So the question is, what's the probability that there is something to these stories, to these footprints? And that's where the weighing of the evidence comes in. If you've got to put in the work before you can draw that conclusion or hold an informed opinion about whether it's likely or not that Sasquatch exists. Yeah.
What about trail cameras? Have you found anyone with a trail camera film or video or footage or film pictures?
No, I haven't.
No, not yet.
Well, no, there've been a few, people who've had some very questionable, ambiguous images, but nothing, just on par with, he's just thumbing through and there's a deer and there's a bear and there's a Bigfoot. It's always something that's, up really close. And so you don't know if that hair is from a raccoon or a bear or a possum or whatever, there just haven't been good pictures. And that's frustrating. That's vexing. It's a point of contention for the skeptics. But on the other hand, there are lots of animals that actively avoid trail cameras, and it's usually some of the most common animals that show up. But there's a literature in the professional, published papers that show active avoidance by things like coyotes or cougars, that whether it's an EM emission or light leakage or some sound, that's not audible to us, or just the novelty that's not hidden well. These creatures walk these paths on a regular basis, and they recognize things that are new, that are out of place. So there was an interesting study recently. I can't cite it now. Memory fails me, but it actually, they actually were monitoring the behavior of animals towards trail cameras that had been placed out, like chimpanzees. I mean, and they were on them just like that. Even ones that were hidden, they were right on them. And you can see the pictures of them coming up, looking in the camera, without any other evident clue or tip off. So if that is true, then a very rare elusive animal like Sasquatch, first of all, the odds of capturing a picture of one, but if they're aware and actively avoiding it, I mean, I've had cameras I've deployed and I've come back in remote areas. We were way removed from, anybody, any road, trail or whatever, come back to find, in this case, these were the older versions where the camera there was a physical little camera and the shutter was hardwired to the sensor, the trip, and you had your batteries in there, and so that you'd load it with film and you'd stick it in and close it up, and we would put those in there. And there were times that I would come back and the latch was undone and the camera chassis or the case wide open, and the camera was dangling by its cable down the side of the tree. Now, what did that? There were no claw marks or chew marks. A bear will chew those plastic trail cameras to pieces. What was responsible for that? If it was a person, I would have thought they would have put it back together after investigating, or they would have taken it. These weren't locked up. They could be carted off. So something that was manipulative, that was curious enough, that pulled the camera out and then left it dangling there. Who knows? I'm not saying it's Sasquatch, but who knows? There was no picture, unfortunately, on any of them of who the culprit was. So they'd been approached from behind the tree, apparently.
What about smell? Do they admit as when, like, the rock throwing or the sounds that they make, has there been a distinctive odor that's not recognizable, that's very pungent?
One person who was keen on the statistics of these and had a large database at that time was John Green, probably one of the first databases before the internet. And he, in one of his tallies, he noted that less than 10% of people who claimed an encounter with Sasquatch noted a noticeable odor. So my own suspicion is, and I've encountered some odors that I couldn't account for. We've tried to narrow them down to see if there was a carcass, or if there was, some skunk cabbage or something, or some plant that would give off an odor at a certain time of the year. And, we just couldn't account for this musky locker room smell, as it's often described as. My personal opinion is that they don't have a constant odor like that. That they probably are as, fastidious groomers as the other great apes are. And, but we know that the other great apes have extremely well-developed apocrine sweat glands across their chest and their axilla and down in the perineum and perianal regions and so forth. We have them to a lesser degree, but that's the difference between the copious, wet, watery sweat that is intended for evaporative cooling. The apocrine, it produces the oily sweat that the bacteria invades, and as it breaks down, produces this musky odor. And of course, those develop when one passes through puberty. These apes have that, and they will emit that in response to threats or to, out of fear, and so forth. There's a great account, to give you a sense of this, when Diane Fossey was describing the first time she experienced a bluff charge by a silverback, when she was developing a rapport with habituating these gorillas to her presence. She said this silverback came barreling. She adopted a submissive posture, but he came barreling at her but stopped just 2 feet short of running over the top of her, bowling her over. But she said she nearly was bowled over by the overwhelming odor that he emitted at that instant. Not always. He didn't always smell like that, but so I think when people smell that, it's in response. It's a fear response or an intimidation response, aggression that's being exhibited by the Sasquatch in their direction. But most of the time, most encounters, 9 out of 10, don't notice any smell.
What about that? You talked about lethal conclusion earlier. What about that bill in Oklahoma where they were going to allow Bigfoot to be shot?
I think it's more publicity stunt than anything. Even these, even the reverse. There was the ordinance in Skamania County in Washington. We actually have a declaration here in Bannock County here in Idaho that was issued in concert with the Bigfoot Rendezvous when we had a conference here in town. And while some members of the county commissioners might be motivated out of a sincere concern or protectiveness of Sasquatch, a lot of it is showboating. I mean, when they're issued on April 1st, that should be your first red flag that it's not necessarily all in seriousness. So likewise, the reverse, opening a hunting season, if it was a straightforward proposition to shoot a Sasquatch, someone would have done it by now.
Yeah, they would have. Yes, most definitely.
So it's a combination of their rarity and a combination of their size and endurance. I've talked to hunters who claim that they have let off a shot, and they actually, one said, he saw it wince and the hair poof where it hit, but it just kept running, he said, and I wasn't going to go look for it, he said. He regretted that he had done it, but it didn't drop it in its tracks. And so an animal with that kind of mass, unless you're a very good shot, you have a spine shot or right through the heart, or you've heard the stories of charging grizzly bears and shot after shot after shot, and they just keep right on coming, even though they may be mortally wounded. The adrenaline is just pumping. And so in this case, it's not attacking, but it's retreating, and it just keeps going. It probably died of its wounds, but not anywhere that someone was going to readily find it, and if they were inclined to look for it. So I think it's a publicity stunt. It's unfortunate. Anything that would encourage, I certainly don't condone anything that would encourage people to be shooting at upright figures in the shadows or in the darkness. It's dangerous for everybody involved, including the Sasquatch, but a lot of people. It's like the fella up in Idaho who donned a ghillie suit and wanted to, make a name for himself on YouTube by running out in front of cars on the highway. Well, he did. He wasn't as nimble as he thought he was, and the first car hit him, and the second car ran over him and killed him. So don't encourage that kind of behavior.
So what about, speaking of carcasses, have they found any bones or anything that can maybe set them apart and say this is a new species out there?
Nothing that's been recognized. There was one titillating, and I've not followed up on it, but Mike Rugg down in Fenton, California, someone brought in a tooth, and I have to say it was an intriguing little tooth. It was, if you held it up to a cast of Gigantopithecus, it was almost a dead ringer for a premolar of Gigantopithecus in its size and shape. It was much of the roots were broken off, and a lot of the pulp cavity was eroded away. He did was able to make a cast of it, a mold and a cast, and I got a little resin copy of it. But he did submit some of that. I can't remember exactly, so I won't point a finger at who took custody of the sample, but unfortunately there was no resulting DNA conclusion arrived at. But no bones, at least none that have been recognized. And again, a point of contention. The skeptics jump on it, and I hate to be perceived as always offering an apologist's rationalization. But if you stop and think about it, I mean, we've alluded to the fact of how rare they are. We've alluded to some of the aspects of their natural history, which would also include a significant lifespan for a large-bodied ape. I wouldn't be surprised if they lived 50, 60 years without accident or disease or, to compromise them. And so the turnover rate, the deaths are infrequent. Think back to the model of Idaho. We said, maybe 300 Sasquatch. Of those 300, how many of them are on death's door at any given year? And an animal like that, that's at the top of its food chain, has no natural predators. When they get old and decrepit, it's kind of like the elephant's graveyard. They just go off and die somewhere out of the way, and then nature takes its course. I used to show my students in my one of my anthropology courses this time-lapse film where an elephant had been poached, and so they set up a time-lapse camera on it to watch what happened to this dead elephant on the Serengeti plains. And it was just amazing, all the animals that came and fed on it, and scavengers and so forth. And pretty soon it was bloating and exploding, and the bacteria and the maggots were working on it, and it was just like it was almost alive again. And it just, this big massive elephant collapses down, and pretty soon you've got the hyenas dragging off the bones, hyenas dragging off the bits of hide, and within 2 weeks that elephant, 2-ton elephant, was gone, absolutely gone. There wasn't a grease spot in the dirt. So if you've got a Sasquatch, that dies in an out of the way place, all those same processes are going to be acting upon it. And the chewers, the gnawers, the analogy that can be drawn is, you mentioned Gigantopithecus. We know very little about Gigantopithecus because the extent of the fossil record includes of Gigantopithecus blacki, that one particular species that's limited to that in East Asia, China and Vietnam. 2 jaws and about 1,000 isolated teeth. And we only have those because porcupines dragged them into the limestone caves where they were denning and chewed up the softer bits like the roots and the dentin, and left the very thick enameled crowns and the thickest parts, the body of the jaw. All the ramus was chewed away right down to the thick parts. If it weren't for limestone caves, where the alkaline environment is conducive to preservation of bone, and the action of the porcupines taking them into the caves, they didn't live there, we would have no fossil record of Gigantopithecus. 0. So, it's kind of interesting if there's not a similar kind of mechanism. Here, there are limestone caves. One of the things I'm interested in possibly doing is touching base with these different caving clubs, see if anyone has ever come upon a big jaw or a big tooth, and if they were doing what's right, they'll leave them in place, maybe report it to a paleontologist. But sometimes they don't want to give away the location of their favorite cave. But I think they could be recruited to look in the place that it's most likely to harbor. But even then, let's go back to our example. Gigantopithecus as a species probably existed for about 1.5 million years. And for that entire time, we've got 2 jaws and 1,000 isolated teeth. Well, Sasquatch may have only been over here, who knows, 100,000 years? So in that time, what's the odds that some bones might have been sequestered in some nook or cranny and someone's happened to find it? I mean, that's my point. Some may criticize it's just an apologist's attempt to rationalize why you don't have bones. But if you really objectively and honestly think about it, how likely is it that we would have found bones except by pure luck. I mean, people are finding new species, new fossil species. You talked about living species, but people are finding new fossil species every once in a while, because we probably only have a fraction. Some estimates are like in the primate fossil record, it's thought that we've only discovered maybe 8% of the taxonomic diversity that actually existed in these paleo communities of primates. So, there's always tomorrow. Bring in a little Annie song there.
Hey, do you have a plaster cast readily available? You can pull up.
Oh yeah, yeah. Let me grab one.
Sweet.
This is got to be one of my favorites, because it's from the Patterson-Gimlin film. It was cast by Bob Titmus, and it has this very distinctive pressure ridge, which is figured so centrally to my modeling of the Sasquatch foot.
I noticed that right in where that pressure ridge is there like that vein feature. Is that part a scar or something?
No, that's just a crack, because a crack in the sand. So as the step was taken, the heel comes up. You can see how the deepest pressure is here, and that then the sand kind of yielded and produced a pressure ridge. There's nothing to keep it compacted. So as that pressure, as that sand bulges up, it tends to crack, expand and crack, and so that plaster just have flowed into these little features, these little cracks there. But I mean, it is the most compelling examples, I think, of this dynamic of the Sasquatch foot, walking on flat, flexible feet, an excellent adaptation for negotiating the very steep, broken terrain that was their primary habitat.
How long is that? How many inches?
This is just under 15 inches. So 14 and a half is the measure that's often given.
Could you estimate the weight that would carry?
Yes. Well, it's hard to do it from the track itself alone. People often ask that, but the conditions of the soil can vary so much and so readily. Sometimes people will come up and they'll make a standing step next to a footprint. Well, that right off the bat is wrong, because the dynamic impact of the foot and the forces of the step and concentration in smaller areas through the duration of the step make a very different kind of imprint than a standing imprint. But the soil conditions, the moisture and so forth can change, just through the course of a day, as the sun dries out and the water table drops or whatever. But what I did for Patty, since we have the scale of her foot, there have been a number of estimates of what her height was and her dimensions. And so taking those, using this scale and taking her proportions, both in side view and in back view, and then creating a model of her body as a series of cylinders and cones and so forth, estimating her volume, I came up with, and knowing what the density of typical tissue, animal tissue is, bone and muscle and so forth. And there's going to be, obviously there's a little margin of error in those estimates, because her skeleton may be more robust than typical and so forth, more muscle than fat, and who knows what. But anyway, I came up with a value on the order of between 700 and 800 pounds, which is actually a bit more than some people. I think estimates were like 450, 500. People really underestimate, because they forget that the volume increases to the cube of linear dimensions. That is, as something gets taller, it's not, you don't just increase isometrically with that increase in length, but the volume is increasing much more rapidly. That's why they have a flat, flexible foot instead of an arched foot. If an arched foot would not support that kind of weight effectively. In humans, people who become obese and are imposing excessive weight on the foot often experience collapsed arches and pronated feet. They become knock-kneed and their foot rolls inward and flat. And so a lot of estimates of Sasquatch weight I think have been grossly underestimated.
Bad.
Isn't that something,
awesome. What's funny is I remember growing up as a kid back to the day when, like in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, I believe there was a toy set of bit red. I think they were red, but they were flat. And I think you could put your boots on them and pretend to walk. And, but then you look at how a foot, you literally have to take giant steps, but you couldn't create that arch, where the foot touches down and all that stuff. Yeah. So someone really has to go. I mean, that's the one distinctive feature when you see these footprints and you see someone had to go out of their way to really falsify if that was fake.
Oh yeah.
Someone would really have to really go out of their way to not only that, make a gorilla suit that for the times look nothing. It's modern day technology, like the costumes, like you're talking about that guy that went to the costume parties. Yeah. That's today. Back then, they were shitty. And in the footprint, to go out of the way to create a footprint of that. Yeah.
Right.
No, I'm sorry.
Well, and to suggest that, you could introduce the kinds of dynamics and the animation, the apparent livingness, if you will, with a pair of carved wooden feet.
Right.
Just recently, someone drew attention to an effort by one investigator or enthusiast, or maybe a skeptic. Probably was a skeptic, who tried to fabricate a costume. And one of the statements in his YouTube video, right off the bat, he said he looked at that film and absolutely those were the carved wooden feet from Ray Wallace. And I knew that the rest of it was just bogus, because if he looked at that and saw the Wallace footprints, he's the kind of person who could look at an apple and an orange and say that they were pears. It wasn't even comparing apples to oranges. He couldn't even tell the difference between an apple and an orange and a pear. And so the rest of his comments about the film were just absolutely vacuous. And they were. I mean, I didn't watch the whole thing and listen to it, but they were vacuous and reflected that same inability to see detail. It was just really surprising that anyone would point to that film as an authoritative statement of condemnation of the film. But
wow, this was awesome. Listen, I am very honored you came on the podcast. I've known about you for years, decades probably. And then you conjure up the memories as a child, looking at that tape and then seeing the footprints and the snow. And I'm so happy you came on. This is one of my most favorite podcasts. I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. And so before we go, are you present on social media where people could follow you on anything? Facebook, Instagram, anything?
On Facebook, I'm under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum. If the people want to kind of have some further reading, of course, if you haven't read my book, it still should be a go-to resource. But my edited journal, which is the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, not just Sasquatch, but looking at relic hominoids around the world, it's at www.isu.edu/RHI for Relic Hominoid. Or if you just Google the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, it'll pop up. And there you'll have, it's an academic journal, peer reviewed. I have an editorial board that assists me, and we have research articles, we have essays, we have short communications, technical notes, commentaries and news items, lots of book reviews. It's a good place if you're wondering whether, this book is a good book or not, or whether you should read it, or excellent book reviews of the, more of the academic books, not every book that comes off. They're multiplying like mushrooms, and a lot of people who probably should stick to other endeavors have thrown their hat into the authorship ring. But you got to be careful where you spend your time. Take a look. The Relic Hominoid Inquiry.
And your book is The Science of Sasquatch, correct?
It's Sasquatch Legend Meets Science.
Okay, Legend Meets Science, and I've seen it on it's on Audible. I believe it's on Audible.
It is now. Yeah, just
Yeah,
recently
yeah.
came out. So if you're,
Okay.
you're more inclined to listen to it, then you can get it, and it's a very, very good reading of it.
And it's also available on Amazon, because I was looking on Amazon. And
Yep, available
yeah,
to
auto
Amazon
Sweet.
and other outlets like Paradise K is another outlet that carries it, and lots of Bigfoot related items.
Cool.
Fun to look
Well,
through their catalog.
Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, thank you again.
You're
I
welcome.
hope we find something, and I'm a believer. So I mean, I'm out in the woods, I hunt elk, I'm up in the mountains, but
Oh.
I'm a believer. So
Yeah,
you're
well.
one of the few things, alien things and others, but Loch Ness, blah, but Bigfoot, they haven't convinced me. Just like the biologist yesterday said, I can't say,
Right.
I've been
Well,
out there and he still doesn't know. So
That's great. Yeah, that's keep an open mind.
yes.
As rare as they are, you never know.
Sweet. Thank you again for coming on. I
Oh, you
really
bet.
appreciate it.
You bet.
All right. Bye.
Bye bye.